Moses is one of the heroes of the faith, and for good reason. And now we stand right at the top of Mount Nebo, where Deuteronomy tells us that he died here, right after God had shown him, given him this view of the land that he had promised. So this is as much a culmination of one of the heroes of the faith's ministry as it is a reminder of the ongoing faithfulness of God to his promises. And that after all this time and all the varying seasons of obedience and disobedience, God is still going to be faithful to his promises. But this comes when Moses is 120 years old. And we know from Acts chapter 7, the stoning of Stephen. Right before Stephen gets stoned to death, he gives a pretty amazing speech. And one that he follows mostly through his speech is Moses. And he kind of time stamps the life of Moses for us to know a little bit more in particular. So for the first 40 years of Moses' life, he's the Prince of Egypt. And can you imagine all the privileges and blessings that came with that? But also the education. Acts says that Moses was educated in all the ways of the Egyptians and was therefore powerful in word and deed. And so just even God's sovereignty in guiding one of his to be educated in a manner like that, provided for in a manner like that. And then imagine the amount of leadership that he would have learned as the Prince of Egypt. Well, then we know that the turning point. At 40 years old, then there's the dilemma with scuffle with one of the Egyptian soldiers, and Moses heads out into the wilderness. And then now for the next 40 years, from 40 years old to 80 years old, Moses is out in the wilderness. And other than the blessing of getting married, and that would be great, he doesn't even have his own flock to shepherd. He's shepherding his father-in-law's flock. So from Prince of Egypt to 40 years now in the wilderness, where there's an awful lot that you could imagine would be going on in Moses' life, and a recalibrating of what it was like to be a family man, a recalibrating of what it was like to be an ordinary man as opposed to the Prince of Egypt, a recalibrating of what it was like to have want for nothing to now having to work for absolutely everything. I mean, even just your survival and your care for your family. And then at 80 years old, then God speaks to him through the burning bush. And that at 80 years old sends him on a pivot point that will begin the last 40 years of his life, where he is used by God to go in and deliver God's people out of slavery in Egypt and make their way toward the promised land. Now we know the story that they get there and because of disobedience aren't allowed in, but they're forced to continue to wander. But it probably wasn't a small number. Benny would probably know way better than I, but it was probably millions of Jewish people coming out into the wilderness. And so now you talk about what an absolute Herculean effort that would be, just to try to lead, what's that, a third of the current, a quarter of the current population of Israel through the wilderness and be able to provide for them. And yet he does. He gets them here. And those stages, can you imagine in that season where you're having to wrestle with God, where you're having to contend for the people that are complaining constantly against you, those that have just watched God perform these plagues, watch the Red Sea part, bring you freedom, get you fresh water not once, twice, feed you from heaven directly, and yet still continue to doubt and to complain. And then you have to totally understand that at some point God's going, okay, Moses, your desert season was one where that was probably a lot of growth in his own heart and in his own life while he was out in the wilderness. So he'd been equipped in his first 40 years with leadership and education. The next 40 years, I think, had a whole lot to do with character and heart development. I'm sure there was some real cool, tangible skills they picked up in the wilderness too, how to eke out the last little bit of dew from a leaf in the morning or whatever that would have been useful 40 years later when he's trying to lead his people. But then he gets them out of slavery and on their way to the promised land. Those stages of life, 40, 40, and 40 years, each radically different, and yet all really crucial and kind of building on the one before it. If generously, if you and I get 30, 30, and 30, that would be really generous today, if we get to see 90 years. And you can probably remember in your first 20, 30 years of life where it just seemed like, you're learning and gathering as much life experience as you can. You probably look back on a season in your life and resonate more with the wilderness season of Moses, that middle 40 of the wandering and the struggle and wondering, God, you had me as a prince, and now what? Now this is what I've got. And not to give up, not to forget that there's often that last 40 for me and you. There's a season to which this is all really kind of culminating, that he's got in mind for me and you down the road. Don't miss the season of life that God has you in. It may not be as clinical or clean cut as what we see in at least the Bible account of Moses' life. But we will all have those seasons where we need to be developing and leaning in and growing up. And we have those seasons where it's maybe not what we wanted, but it's what God had for us. And it's a development of our heart and our soul. But then how amazing it is to watch God continue to be faithful to us. And for some, it might be midlife for you. Some of you, it might be senior stage of life, where he finally makes sense of something way back in your past that happened a whole long time ago. It might be something in your 60s, 70s, or 80s, where all of a sudden you go, wow, God's using me more now than in my entire life to this point. And so everybody on this trip, there's still so much more that God has for you. And to be faithful to him over this long journey, regardless of the roller coaster of what your particular season looks like, knowing that he's faithful to you. I mean, that's the huge blessing. To me, I'll stand here forever now and think about God's faithfulness. I'll be reminded of it showing up through Moses, but I'll be most mindful of the faithfulness of God to get all of his people exactly where he promised to get his people to. And he used people to accomplish those purposes. Did you know he's still using all of you today? He's still got seasons ahead for every single one of you. And then, as we know really well, Moses is really just a amazing reflection of Jesus. That what Moses did tangibly for the Hebrews, Jesus has done for us and continues to do, to deliver people out of slavery in Egypt and get them to the promised land. Jesus is the one that makes the way. And so as you take a look out over this view, as hazy it is now, it's probably equivalent to the haziness of our picture of what heaven's going to be like. Gosh, we're so close. I want to see all the details and whatnot. But maybe some of that haziness is okay, because maybe sometimes there's still some stuff right here, right now, in this next season that God has while you're still alive. He's still using you. And then someday you'll see in full the full glory of what he's preparing for those who love him. So again, be reminded of his faithfulness to you and the opportunity that you've got to be faithful to him, whatever season you're in right now.
We're having pictures inside. Then when you finish,